The Great Migration period is one of, if not the most important period in European history. It was a time of tremendous changes that reworked the face of the continent forever. Empires fell and other empires rose. Entire peoples drifted away from their homelands in search for better life or out of struggle for their existence. Yet, during those times of unprecedented chaos and uncertainty, one man managed to make a name for himself and become arguably the most influential figure of an entire age. He was known for his ruthlessness and ambition. The Romans called him Flagellum Dei, or the Scourge of God. His name was Attila the Hun. Before we take a look at the life and deeds of Attila, it is important to understand his background and the historical context in which he lived. The most substantial issue when gathering information about Attila and the Huns is the lack of reliable information. The Huns did not have the practice of recording significant events in the manner that other civilizations like the Greeks or the Romans did. Also, the Huns were nomads. This means that, unlike most other civilizations, they did not leave many physical artifacts behind to be studied by modern historians and archaeologists. Thus, most of what we know about the Huns comes from the works of Roman chroniclers and historians. One such historian was Priscus the Thracian, a contemporary of Attila's, who acted as an ambassador for the Eastern Roman Empire and lived with the Huns for an extended period of time. In fact, Priscus is the only historian who has written about Attila while he was still alive. Unfortunately, his writings did not survive until nowadays and only reach us through the works of later historians who quote Priscus's original writings. The Huns first appear in Roman writings during the latter half of the 4th century AD. Their history before this period remains unknown to modern historians despite much speculation about their origin. Perhaps the most popular theory about the origin of the Huns connects them to the Xiongnu nomads who invaded China over a century before the Hunnic arrival in Europe. While this connection has never been conclusively proven, this has remained the predominant theory regarding the origins of the Huns, and consequently they have been often depicted as having East Asian physical characteristics in modern media. To look at the Huns as a nation or as a people is an incorrect approach. Ultimately, the Huns were a confederation of tribes coming from a variety of different cultural, religious, and ethnic backgrounds. It is also important to note that by the time the Huns made their way into the heart of Europe and started interacting with the Roman Empire, the population of their empire was predominantly European. Thus, by the time the Huns clashed with the Romans, it is reasonable to assume that a sizable part of their military also consisted of European people, a fact which will be reflected in this documentary. Furthermore, based on modern technology and genetic studies, historians from the 20th and the 21st century have concluded that the Huns were of predominantly European ancestry, with only some individuals having ancestry from East Asia. But what about Attila's appearance? He has also often been depicted as having European features throughout history and in modern times. Supposedly, Attila belonged to the Hunnic aristocracy, so an argument could be made that he most likely had more Asian ancestry than the average Hun. The only first-hand description of Attila that we have once again comes from Priscus. He describes Attila as follows: short of stature, with a broad chest and a large head. His eyes were small, his beard thin and sprinkled with gray, and he had a flat nose and swarthy skin, showing evidence of his origin. This description of Attila has been interpreted by historians in several different ways. While some argue that this description clearly portrays Attila as having East Asian features in the eyes of Priscus, others argue that the passage is more reminiscent of how the Romans would describe someone belonging to the Iranian culture group, such as a Parthian or Scythian. Furthermore, it is interesting to note that Priscus, as well as other Roman historians, often use the words meaning Scythian and Hunnic interchangeably, which once again could be interpreted in different ways. For one, this could hint to the fact that the Huns and the Scythians were closely related culturally, hence why the Romans used the words interchangeably. It is also possible that the term Hun was simply used to refer to the nomads who came from the Eurasian steppes, once again inferring that the Huns did not belong to a single nation. Finally, it is also possible that the Romans were simply sloppy with their terminology and descriptions, as they have a reputation of intentionally or unintentionally portraying barbarian peoples inaccurately. Ultimately, we cannot rely on Roman sources too much as they are inherently biased. The Romans had radically different concepts of race, ethnicity, and culture compared to how we understand them today. So even if Priscus tried his best to describe Attila and the Huns as objectively as possible and did not use any rhetoric in his writings, it is important not to over-rely on his descriptions. Much like other elements of Attila's life, little is known about his early years. The exact year of his birth remains unknown to modern historians, although it has been narrowed down to a period of about 10 years. Attila was most likely born during the latter half of the 390s or during the first few years of the 5th century AD. Little is known about his family tree as well. We know that the name of Attila's father was Mundzuk. Mundzuk was the brother of two chieftains ruling the Huns before Attila's ascension, named Ruga and Oktar. It is also not understood how Hunnic succession worked, but we know that Attila and his brother Bleda were in line to rule after the death of Ruga. For the first 11 years after their succession, they ruled the Huns conjointly until Bleda's death. The Romans and the Huns had established relations long before Attila's rise to power. At times, the two sides were hostile to each other, with the Huns coming on top, plundering Roman settlements and capturing Roman territory. By the start of Attila and Bleda's reign, the Romans were forced to pay annual tribute to the Huns. During this time, the Roman Empire was separated into two parts, ruled by two different emperors, with Constantinople being the capital in the east and Ravenna the capital in the west. The Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self and was experiencing a multitude of issues at the time. It was constantly being invaded by barbarian tribes, either seeking refuge from the Huns or simply trying to benefit from the empire's weakened state. For this reason, the Romans were content with paying tribute to the Huns, who were already a sizable military power before Attila's rise. One of Attila's first actions in charge of the Huns was to negotiate a treaty with the Romans, requiring the tribute that they pay be doubled and adding a number of other stipulations that the Romans had to follow. The Romans, fearing a Hunnic invasion, agreed to the disadvantageous conditions. In 440, after a successful campaign against the Burgundians and an unsuccessful campaign against the Sassanids, the Huns were once again in hostile relations with the Roman Empire after they found out that the Romans had breached various clauses of the Treaty of Morgus, which the two sides had signed 5 years earlier. After raiding the Roman border alongside the Danube River, the Huns launched a full-scale invasion into eastern Roman territory. Crossing the Danube and sacking several major Roman cities on the Balkans, the Huns met little resistance as the Romans were dealing with two major invasions at the time, one in North Africa against the Vandals and one to the east against the Sassanids. Nevertheless, the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius elected to fight the Huns as he saw a fighting chance to defeat them after having consolidated his army and the defenses of his capital several years prior. Theodosius' choice to start a full-scale conflict with the Huns was a major mistake. The superior cavalry of the nomadic Huns gave them an advantage when it came to open field battles, but they had experienced difficulties in the past when it came to capturing walled cities. This was not the case anymore, however, as the Huns were now capable of using siege equipment such as siege towers and battering rams. The Hunnic force was stronger than ever and was no match for the Romans. Attila and Bleda laid waste to the Balkans, sacking vital Roman cities such as Nisus, Serdica, and Philippopolis. Eventually, the Huns reached Constantinople itself. However, the newly built Theodosian walls eventually proved too much of a challenge for the Huns. Nevertheless, having suffered two decisive defeats against the Huns near Constantinople and Callipolis, and having seen the cruelty that the Huns were capable of, ravaging through Roman holdings in the Balkans, Theodosius saw no choice but to negotiate peace with Attila. The treaty was harsher than before. The annual tribute that the Romans had to pay the Huns was tripled, and a one-time payment of 2 tons of gold had to be made to the Huns. Bleda died shortly after under suspicious circumstances. It was speculated that Bleda was killed as a result of a plot led by Attila himself. Whatever the case, after 11 years of conjoined rulership, Attila was now the sole ruler of the Huns. Having a vast empire under his control and a massive tribute from the Roman Empire, Attila was now arguably the single most powerful person in all of Europe. Having defeated the Roman Empire once, Attila, being the ambitious man that he was looking to go even further. At this point, he realized that the Eastern Roman Empire was no match for him, and shortly after his first victory, launched a second campaign in the Balkans. He defeated the Eastern Roman army once again at the Battle of Utust and ravaged all the way into the heart of the province of Macedonia. Once again, Attila was halted at Constantinople, deciding not to attack the city after having suffered more casualties this time. Attila's next move was unknown for the Romans, but after having 2 successful campaigns against the eastern remnants of the empire, it became evident that he would strike again. Even though the empire was technically one entity at the time, Attila managed to keep good relations with Valentinian, the emperor in the west, as the Huns and the Western Roman forces had never had a major clash at this point and had been allies at previous occasions. Attila did not intend to attack the Western Roman Empire, at least for the time being. Instead, he started his next campaign against an enemy of the Romans, the Visigoths, who had established a kingdom in southern France and Iberia. This was until Attila received an unusual request. Emperor Valentinian had a sister named Honoria. As was tradition at the time, Honoria was supposed to enter a forced marriage with a member of the Roman aristocracy, namely a senator named Bassus. As an act of desperation and in an attempt to escape the situation, Honoria sent her engagement ring directly to Attila himself, pleading for help. Attila, wanting to make the best out of the situation, reconsidered his plans. Attila proclaimed that he interpreted the message as a marriage request by Honoria, which he would accept, but he would require half of the Western Roman Empire as dowry. Emperor Valentinian quickly learned of the situation and tried to convince Attila that Honoria was a traitor and that the marriage proposal was illegitimate. His efforts to de-escalate the situation, however, failed, as Attila did not want to pass the tremendous opportunity that the supposed marriage proposal had opened for him. Some modern historians dispute the fact that this was the reason Attila's relations with the empire in the west deteriorated, and several possible reasons have been suggested. For example, some historians claim that the Huns and the Romans supported 2 different heirs in a Frankish succession dispute. Others have suggested that Attila was encouraged to attack the Romans by Gaiseric, the king of the Vandals at the time, who was allied to Attila, or that Attila simply did not care for maintaining good relations with the Roman Empire and saw an opportunity to make gains for himself. Whatever the case, Attila launched a full-scale invasion on the Western Roman Empire in 451 AD. By this point, a new major player had entered the scene. His name was Flavius Aetius, and he was the Magister Militum in the West, the second highest title in the Western Empire after the one held by the emperor himself. Aetius, as the main person in charge of the Roman military, was the one who was tasked with repelling the Huns. Aetius was the right man for the job, not only because he had proven himself as an excellent commander during campaigns in Gaul and Germania, but he was also no stranger to the Huns. He had spent several years as a Hunnic captive living among the Huns, but more importantly, he had led an earlier campaign against the Burgundians using Huns as mercenaries. While Aetius started assembling a force against Attila, the Huns started ravaging through the province of Gaul. The fate of Gaul was similar to the fate that the Balkans suffered less than a decade earlier. They sacked multiple cities including Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, and eventually reached Paris, which they spared. By the time Attila advanced to the city of Aurelianum, Aetius had already assembled an anti-Hunnic force, thus prompting Attila to retreat after an unsuccessful assault on the city. Aetius had not only mustered troops from the Western Roman Empire, but he had assembled somewhat of a coalition against the Huns. Most importantly, he had convinced Theodoric, the king of the hostile Visigoths, to aid him in his efforts against Attila. Attila attempted to avoid fighting the Roman Visigothic alliance and flee from Gaul, but the coalition joined forces near Aurelianum and eventually caught up with Attila. Thus the two sides clashed at the Battle of the Catalonian Place, which became the culmination of Attila's campaign in Gaul. Very little is certain about the battle, as sources on it are conflicting, but we do know that the two forces were evenly matched, each consisting of tens of thousands of men. The coalition troops deployed in front of Attila's position, placing the Visigoths on their right flank on top of a steep ridge, which provided a significant defensive advantage. Their left flank was comprised of Roman troops under Aetius, and an army of Alans under King Sangiban was in the middle. Attila took a different approach, placing his elite Hunnic cavalry in the middle of his formation while placing his Gepid subordinates on the right flank and his Ostrogothic allies on the left. Attila advanced in the center, quickly overwhelming the Alan troops and routing them. The Ostrogoths and the Gepids then advanced to engage the two flanks. Fighting was fierce at this point, with no side managing to make a significant breakthrough. Attila then engaged the Visigoths on the ridge, attempting to overrun them, killing Theodoric in the process. The battle was turning in Attila's favor until a decisive Visigothic charge led by Theodoric's son Thorismund, which managed to inflict a lot of casualties on the Ostrogothic troops. After the two sides had fought for hours, the sun had started to set and the battlefield was getting dark. Seeing that there was no victory in sight, Attila decided to retreat back to his camp. The following day, the Romans and their allies decided not to pursue any further conflict, thus ending the battle inconclusively. Thousands, potentially tens of thousands of men, lie dead on the battlefield with no clear victor in the battle. Attila retreated from Gaul shortly after. One could argue that the Romans successfully repelled the Huns from Gaul and were the victors in the campaign. To the contrary, an argument could be made that the Huns were never decisively defeated, and despite suffering heavy losses to their troops, they returned victorious from Gaul. Despite not achieving a decisive victory, the Battle of the Catalonian Place undoubtedly served as reassurance for the Romans that Attila was not invincible. Furthermore, it solidified Aetius' legacy as one of the last Romans. Nevertheless, the Romans knew that Attila was not defeated and that his return was inevitable. Not even a full year after the campaign in Gaul, Attila was back at the Romans' gates. This time he advanced directly into the Roman homeland of Italy. Much like his earlier campaigns against the Romans, Attila met close to no resistance in the initial stage of his attack, rampaging through northern Italy, sacking and razing multiple Roman cities. His campaign was short-lived, however, as he left Italy before reaching Rome. It is unknown exactly why Attila abandoned his campaign before sacking Rome, but there are several possible explanations. Priscus believed that he did not attack Rome out of superstition, as the Visigothic king Alaric died shortly after sacking it. Many give credit to Pope Leo I for convincing Attila to withdraw from Italy after having private negotiations with him. It is also very likely that Attila's army succumbed to hunger, since Italy was experiencing a major famine at the time. Additionally, the Eastern Romans, now under Theodosius' successor, Marcian, had stopped paying tribute to the Huns and launched an invasion into their territory, giving Attila another reason to return home. Before he could launch a new invasion on the Eastern Roman Empire, Attila died during a feast, celebrating a marriage to a new bride. According to Priscus, Attila died of suffocation following a nosebleed, but other theories suggest that he might have suffered a stroke or died due to complications due to heavy drinking. Many also speculated that he was poisoned. Shortly after, he was given a proper Hunnic burial and laid to rest at an unknown location. and thus ended the life of a man who was the most influential figure in one of the most significant periods of European history. With his death, the end of his empire was also drawing near. His son Elek was unable to live up to Attila's legacy, losing at the Battle of Nidau to a coalition of previously subjugated tribes and peoples, and effectively marking the end of the Hunnic Empire's influence in Europe. By the end of the 5th century AD, the last remnants of the Hunnic Empire would fall apart, with the name of the Huns never appearing in history again. We can only speculate what would have happened had Attila lived longer, or had he managed to ensure the stability of his empire following his death. The events that occurred after he died, however, were inevitable. The rapid expansion and the unstable nature of the Hunnic Empire made it very fragile and susceptible to fracturing. Even though the Huns controlled an extremely large domain, they never managed to consolidate their subjects and fully integrate them into their empire. It seemed as though Attila was not interested in building an empire that would withstand the test of time in the first place, but he was rather interested in cementing his own legacy and reputation. And that he certainly did. Attila was unquestionably the single most influential individual of the Great Migration, and his likeness remains an inseparable part of Western culture almost 15 centuries after his death.